Adrian Moretti drew his gun on his own bed at 2 in the morning. Something was breathing under his blanket. 5 years nobody had slept in that room, not since his wife bled out on those same sheets with her eyes still open. He ripped the cover back with his finger already on the trigger and found his new maid curled up and burning with fever, still wearing her gray uniform, still wearing one shoe. Every instinct in him said drag her out into the snow. Instead, he set the gun down and lay beside her. Subscribe right now and stay with this story to the very end, and comment the city you are watching from so I can see how far this story has traveled. He did not shoot her. That was the first thing Adrian Moretti would remember about the night everything changed, and for a long time afterward, he could not explain it to himself. He had killed men for standing too close to his car. He had put a bullet through a cousin who lied about a shipment manifest, and yet a woman he could not name was breathing into his pillow, and his hand simply stopped. She had a fever. He could feel it radiating off her from 2 feet away, that dry animal heat that comes off a body fighting something it is losing to. Her hair had come loose from its knot and spread across the pillow he had not touched in 5 years. Her fist was closed against her chest the way a child holds something she is afraid will be taken. He stood there for 4 full minutes with the safety off, waiting for himself to become the man he was supposed to be. That man never arrived. Just 3 weeks earlier, Adrian Moretti had ruined a dinner. It had been arranged for 6 weeks. Enzo Varga had reserved the entire back room of a restaurant he owned in the North End, and he had brought his niece, and everyone at that table understood what the girl was for. She was 22, poured into red silk, wearing a perfume so expensive, it announced itself before she did. Varga wanted the Charlestown docks. Varga wanted them without a war. So he had wrapped his ambition in a young woman and put a ring beside her water glass like it was a business card. Adrian let him talk for 11 minutes. Varga spoke about the northern ports, about the value of consolidation, about how a man of 36 ought to be thinking about heirs. He spoke about tradition. He spoke about how alone Adrian had become since the funeral, and how the whole family worried, and how a house that size should have children in it. The girl kept her eyes on the tablecloth. She had been coached not to speak. Her hands trembled around her clutch, and Adrian noticed that, and something old and tired turned over in his chest because he understood exactly what she was. She was a payment. She had been raised to be a payment. She had probably known, since she was 15, that some man would eventually be handed her name across a table like this, and tonight was simply the night. He told Varga no. He did not raise his voice. He never did. He said that he did not want an alliance, he did not want a wife, and he did not want anyone's niece. Then he said that 3 shipments had gone missing out of Varga's warehouses in November, $5 million of merchandise that had walked away on its own, and that a marriage did not refund a debt. He gave Varga until Friday. The temperature in that room dropped so hard that the waiter outside felt it through the door. Varga's smile stayed on his face like something nailed there. He said Adrian was being unreasonable. Adrian agreed that he was buttoned his jacket and walked out without looking at the girl again, because he knew that if he looked at her, he would have to think about what happened to girls like her when they failed. He did not think about her again for 3 weeks. When he finally did, it would be too late for both of them. There was a man standing behind Adrian's chair that entire dinner. Nobody paid attention to him. That was his job. Dominic Hale was 29 and he ran the night security detail, and he had been in the Moretti house since he was 14 years old. Since the winter, Adrian found him sleeping in a stairwell with a broken wrist and brought him home without asking anyone's permission. Dominic poured the wine that night. He cleared the glasses. He laughed at a joke one of Varga's men made, and he laughed a half-second too long, and he held the man's eyes a half-second past comfortable. Adrian saw it. He was a man who noticed the angle of a shoulder from across a warehouse. He absolutely saw it, and he let it go because he had taught that boy to shave, and there are blind spots you build on purpose, and those are the ones that kill you. Remember the laugh. Everything that burns down later starts with that laugh. 30 miles away, in an apartment where the radiator only worked if you hit it, a woman named Elena Marsh was doing arithmetic that had no solution. The hospital bill said $74,000. That was the balance, not the total. The total lived somewhere in a hallway of her mind she kept a door closed on. She was 24 years old. She had 2 jobs, a cracked phone, 4 hours of sleep on a good night, and a 12-year-old sister named Sophie who no longer had any hair. Sophie had been diagnosed in March, acute leukemia. The word had entered their lives on a Tuesday afternoon in a hallway delivered by a doctor who was kind about it, and after that there was no more before. There was only the schedule. Transfusions, counts, the bone marrow registry, the waiting. Their mother had died when Elena was 19 and Sophie was 7, which meant Elena had been somebody's mother for 5 years and somebody's child for none of them. She had already sold their mother's ring. She had already sold the car and started taking 2 buses. She had already learned the specific humiliation of asking a billing department to please keep a child on a list. So when the posting came through from an agency, a domestic position out in Brookline, love and optional discretion required salary, triple the market rate, Elena did not ask why a housekeeping job paid triple. She had stopped asking why about anything. She only asked when she could start. The woman who interviewed her was named Camilla Thorne, and she did not shake hands. She lined up 5 new hires in the front hall of the Moretti estate and read them the law like a sentence being handed down. They would not speak unless spoken to. They would not make eye contact with Mr. Moretti or with anyone who came to see him. They would not ask questions about what they saw, what they heard, or what they cleaned. They would not carry phones above the ground floor. If a room was locked, it stayed locked. Then Mrs. Thorne explained the salary. She explained that triple the market rate was not generosity. It was the price of silence paid in advance, and if any of them broke that silence, they would not simply be dismissed. She let the sentence end there. She did not finish it. That was the point. 2 of the 5 women looked like they wanted to leave. One of them actually did 3 days later, and nobody ever mentioned her name again. Elena stood there and thought about a bone marrow registry and about the beeping of an infusion pump, and about how much a single night in a pediatric oncology ward cost. And she did not care if this man was running weapons occult or a campaign for governor. He was a signature on a check. That was all he would ever be to her. She was assigned to the East Wing on her first day. She did not understand why the other maids went quiet when they heard it. Nobody had cleaned the East Wing consistently in 5 years because nobody lasted. Elena learned the rules by breaking small ones. She learned he could not stand the smell of lavender because she used a lavender polish once, and Mrs. Thorne came up the stairs so fast she was breathing through her mouth. She learned he drank his coffee black and left it half finished. She learned that he read at 3 in the morning because she came in at 6 and the lamp would still be warm. She learned that he did not sleep in his own bed. That took her 11 days to be sure of, and the sheets were never disturbed. The pillows held their shape. Every morning she made a bed that had not been slept in, and every night somebody left a blanket crumpled on the leather chair in the corner, and she stopped believing in coincidence around day 9. She never asked. That was the entire reason she survived when the others had not. And on day 14, cleaning out the bottom of a dresser drawer, her hand touched a picture frame lying face down under a folded shirt. She did not turn it over. She had been raised by a woman who taught her that other people's grief is not entertainment. She put the shirt back exactly as it had been, closed the drawer, and finished the room. She thought about that frame for a week and never mentioned it to a living soul. She would remember that decision for the rest of her life because it was the first choice she ever made that Adrian Moretti did not see, and it was the one that saved her. The letter came on a Thursday. It was 2 paragraphs long, printed on hospital letterhead, and it explained in polite administrative language that the family's coverage would terminate at the end of the calendar year, and that patients whose financial responsibility could not be verified would be reviewed by the board for continued participation in transplant candidacy. Elena read it 4 times, standing at the mailboxes in her building with her coat still buttoned. And she did not cry. Tears had never once in her entire life paid a bill. She went to work. The fever started on a Monday night, and by Tuesday morning, it owned her. Her throat felt like it had been scrubbed with sand. Her joints ached in a deep, humming way that made the stairs a negotiation. She woke up at 4:30, shaking under 2 blankets, and she lay there for exactly 1 minute, considering the word sick. And then she got up because Mrs. Thorne did not accept sick days because a missed shift meant a doctor day because Sophie's next round was on Friday, and the copay did not care that Elena had a virus. She swallowed 3 ibuprofen dry. She wrapped a scarf twice around her neck. She took 2 buses in the dark. The heat of the house hit her at the service door like a hand on her chest, and she had to hold the frame for a second to keep from going down. Mrs. Thorne barely looked up. "East Wing," she said. Mr. Moretti was out on business and expected the suite done before he returned. Elena made it halfway up the back staircase and had to sit on a step with her forehead against the wall until the black spots cleared. She got up. She always got up. That was the whole tragedy of her. If anyone had bothered to look, this was a woman who had never in her adult life been allowed to lie down. Adrian spent that Tuesday at the docks in the kind of cold that makes metal feel wet. They had found the leak, or thought they had. A warehouse manager named Petrosian had been shaving 4% off the inbound manifest and selling it sideways to men who worked for Varga. He had done it for 6 months. He had done it clumsily, which was how they caught him, and stupidly, which was why nobody could save him. The man went down on his knees on the concrete and started talking about his children. He had two. He said their names. He said them twice because he had heard somewhere that saying a name makes you human to the person deciding. Adrian felt nothing. That was what disturbed him, standing there in the wind with his hands in his coat pockets. Not anger, not even disgust, just a bone-deep gray weariness, the sense of having watched this exact scene several hundred times, of being a man trapped inside a loop that would only end when someone finally got the better of him. He told Petrosian he should have thought about his children before he stole. Then he nodded once at Raphael and turned around and walked to the car. The shot came when he was 11 steps away. He did not flinch. He had not flinched in years, and somewhere on the drive back, he found himself wondering when exactly that had stopped and whether it was the kind of thing a man could get back. He had a headache that had been building for 3 days. He wanted a shower. He wanted the silence of his own floor. He wanted to lie on that leather chair in the corner of a room he could not sleep in and wait for morning like he had waited for 1,800 mornings before it. Elena did not remember lying down. She remembered fighting the duvet cover, which was enormous and heavy and felt like wrestling a parachute. She remembered her arms shaking. She remembered smoothing the last corner and reaching across the middle of the mattress, and then the room tilted very gently, the way a boat does, and her knees simply stopped participating. She went down onto the bed on her side. 1 minute, she told herself, 60 seconds, catch your breath and get up. The mattress was the softest thing she had touched in 4 years. The room was warm. She was so tired that the tiredness had become a physical object she had been carrying, and for one moment she set it down, and her body seized the opening like a starving animal. She curled onto her left side and pulled her knees up and was gone before she finished the thought. She slept for 4 hours and 40 minutes. Nobody came looking for her. That was the thing about being a woman who cleaned houses. She was already invisible. It simply had never occurred to anyone that invisible people could go missing. The door opened at 14 minutes past 2. Adrian came in on muscle memory. Enter, lock, disarm. He had his jacket over his arm and his tie already loose, and he had unclipped the shoulder holster before he registered the shape on the bed. Then everything in him went to iron. His hand found the backup weapon at his waist before his mind finished the sentence. He moved across the floor without a sound. Somebody was in his room. Somebody had gotten past 12 men and an electric fence and biometric locks and was lying in his bed, which meant either an assassin arrogant enough to wait or a message or a body left there to be found. He took the safety off. He reached down and tore the blanket back. And the fever heat rolled up at him, and a young woman made a small wounded sound and curled tighter, and his brain understood what his eyes were looking at about 1 second before his heart did. She was lying on her left side with her knees drawn up and her right hand closed against her chest. That was the exact position Isabel used to sleep in. Isabel had died in that position on that side of that mattress 5 years and 2 months earlier, with the window behind her broken and her eyes open and Adrian screaming into a phone in a language he had not spoken since he was a boy. He had never had the room repainted. He had never moved the bed. He had simply stopped lying down in it, which everyone in that house understood, and nobody ever said out loud, and which was the entire reason a maid in the East Wing had been quietly making a bed nobody slept in for the last 31 days. Adrian stood over Elena Marsh with a loaded gun in his hand and could not get enough air. A reasonable man wakes her. A ruthless one drags her down the stairs by her collar and throws her out the gate as a lesson to the rest of the staff. And by breakfast, the story would be all over the house, and nobody would ever again make the mistake of thinking that room was a room. He was too tired to be either of those men. He looked at her fingernails, which were bitten down. He looked at the frayed cuff of a uniform she had clearly been repairing herself. He looked at her face flushed and drawn with the kind of exhaustion carved into it that does not come from one bad night. It comes from years. He knew that face. He shaved in front of it every morning. She was not an assassin. She was somebody's whole world holding itself together with both hands. He thumbed the safety gun and set the gun on the nightstand. He looked at the door. He looked back at her. He stood there so long his legs began to ache. Then Adrian Moretti sat down on the far edge of the bed, pulled off his shoes, and lay down on his back on top of the covers, fully dressed with 3 feet of empty mattress between them. He stared at the ceiling and listened to a stranger breathe. He did not remember closing his eyes. He only knew that when he opened them, the storm had stopped the light. Through the curtains had turned that flat winter white, and for the first time in 5 years, Adrian Moretti had slept the entire night through. Beside him, the woman shifted, made a sound, and began to wake up. And out in the corridor, standing in a doorway, he had no reason to be standing in at 6 in the morning. Dominic Hale watched the East Wing Hall and did exactly what he had been paid to do, which was nothing at all. She woke up thinking she was going to die. Not in a dramatic way. In the flat, practical way a person understands a fact. She surfaced out of the fever with her cheek on a pillow that smelled like cedar and cold rain, and her body registered warmth and safety about half a second before her mind caught up and told her exactly where she was. And then the panic came down on her like a ceiling. She got as far as her heel, hitting something solid and warm before she froze. I was already awake. He had been awake for a while, propped on one elbow, watching her come apart in stages. And the worst part was that his face held nothing at all. Not anger, not amusement. She had prepared herself for rage. Rage she could have handled because rage has a shape and an end. What she got instead was a man looking at her the way a person looks at a bill they have not decided whether to pay. She apologized 11 times in under a minute. She hurt herself doing it. She told him she was sick, that she had only sat down for a second, that she would leave right now, that he should not pay her for the week, that she would be off the property in 10 minutes. She got her feet on the floor and her knees folded, and she caught the nightstand with one hand, and the humiliation of that was so total that she almost laughed. He told her to stop moving. He did not shout it. That was what stopped her, the fact that he did not have to. She stood there, hanging onto a piece of furniture in a room she had cleaned 31 times, waiting to find out what happened to women who did what she had just done. He said she had a fever, not a question. He said she had been shaking most of the night, that she had pulled the blanket off him twice. And then he said, in exactly the same tone a man uses to report the weather, that she talked in her sleep. That was when Elena felt the floor genuinely move, because she knew what she talked about in her sleep, and it had a name, and it was 12 years old. She waited for him to ask who Sophie was. He did not. He crossed the room, poured water from a pitcher, and held the glass out to her. She stared at it. She was 24 years old, and she had been raised in a city where nobody handed you anything, and her first honest thought was that it was some kind of trick. Then she took it because her throat felt like it had been sanded, and because she had reached the point of exhaustion where dying of poison seemed like a reasonable outcome to the day. Her fingers brushed his. His hand was warm and completely steady. She drank the whole glass. She asked him why he had not woken her up. It came out before her judgment could catch it, which was the kind of mistake that got people fired in that house, and she braced for it. He said he had been tired and she had been quiet, and it had seemed like too much effort. It was a lie so obvious that she almost said so. He had 12 armed men downstairs. He had a house full of people whose entire function was removing problems. It would have taken 30 seconds and one phone call, and instead a man who put people in the ground for stealing 4% had lain down on top of his own blankets and slept next to a stranger. Neither of them was going to look directly at that. Not that morning, possibly not ever. He told her to get her shoes. He told her to go down to the kitchen and inform Mrs. Thorne that she had the day off paid, and Elena said before she could stop herself that Mrs. Thorne would fire her. He said she would not, and then he gave the order that changed everything. From that day forward, Elena Marsh was the only person permitted in the East Wing. Nobody else. Not the day staff, not the deep cleaners, not Mrs. Thorne herself. She was halfway down the hall before she understood what he had actually done to her. She had not been rewarded. She had been marked. The kitchen went silent when she walked into it. Not the polite silence of people minding their business. The other kind, the kind where a room decides something about you all at once. Mrs. Thorne looked up from her clipboard and asked where she had been, and Elena heard her own voice say that Mr. Moretti had needed the suite cleaned, and she watched the older woman's eyes move over her hair, her uniform, her mouth doing the math that everyone in that house was going to do for the next month. Nobody accused her of anything. That would have been survivable. Instead, they simply stopped speaking when she entered a room and started again when she left. And a woman named Rosa, who had shared her bus route for 2 weeks, began sitting somewhere else, and the whole thing was accomplished without a single word being said out loud, which is how women have always been destroyed by other women. By the fourth day, Elena had stopped going to the break room at all. She ate standing in a back stairwell, and Mrs. Thorne started keeping a notebook. Elena saw it on day 6, a small black notebook, and in it, in that cramped, efficient handwriting, times 6:02, 6:40, 2:15. Every time Elena went up the back stairs and every time she came down, the head housekeeper of a house where discretion was the entire product had begun documenting the movements of a maid, and Elena told herself it was jealousy or protocol or an old woman protecting her territory. She would find out what it actually was in 3 weeks in the dark with a gun in her hand. What saved her sanity during those weeks was that the room itself started talking to her. It began with the jacket. She came in on a Thursday and found a charcoal suit jacket thrown over the armchair, and the left cuff had a dark stain on it that had dried the color of rust, and she stood there holding $4,000 of Italian wool and understood exactly what she was looking at. She did not call anyone. She did not run. She had spent 5 years in hospital corridors, and blood was not a mystery to her. It was a substance, and substances came out if you knew what you were doing. She went into the bathroom, got the hydrogen peroxide out of her own cleaning caddy, and worked at the cuff for 20 minutes until the fabric was clean. Then she hung the jacket back in his closet on the correct hanger, facing the correct direction, and she said nothing to anyone for the rest of her life. He noticed by that evening. Of course he did. So he tested her. He left a loaded Glock in the center of his desk and beside it opened a ledger with routing numbers for accounts in 3 countries. It was not subtle. It was not meant to be. It was a straight line drawn on the floor, and either she stepped over it or she did not. And if she did, he would know within a day, and she would simply stop existing. She came in at 6. She saw the gun. She saw the book. She dusted around them. Then she went back, because the wood underneath the pistol was going to scratch. And she folded a microfiber cloth into a neat square, lifted the weapon by the frame, the way you lift something you are afraid of, set it down on the cloth, and squared the ledger to the edge of the desk because he liked things aligned. Adrian came home at 2 in the morning, saw a Glock resting on a folded dust cloth like a wristwatch on a jeweler's counter, and made a sound he had not made in 5 years. He laughed. It came out of him rough and wrong, and it startled him so badly that he stopped instantly and stood in the middle of his own bedroom, feeling like an intruder. He did not know if the woman was brilliant or so far past fear that nothing registered anymore, or simply broken in a way that made her useful. He lay down on the leather chair that night and realized with something close to alarm that he was waiting for morning. Not for a report, not for a shipment. I wanted to see what she would do next. She started leaving milk. That was the part he never told anyone. When she came up at 6 and the reading lamp was still warm and the biography was face down on the arm of the chair, she began leaving a glass of warm milk on the side table before she went down, because that was what her mother had done for her during the 2 years Elena could not sleep after the funeral, and it was the only remedy she knew. He never thanked her. He never mentioned it. He drank it every time. And on a Tuesday in the 3rd week, she came into the room and there were 2 armchairs in the corner where there had always been one. She stood in the doorway with her cart and stared at that second chair for a long moment, and then went to work and never said a word about it, and neither did he, and that was somehow the most intimate thing that had happened to either of them in years. Then she opened the wrong drawer. She was cleaning out the bottom of the dresser, and her hand found the picture frame, again face down under a folded shirt, and this time the shirt had shifted and the frame slid. And before she could stop it, she saw glass and part of a woman's face. She put it back in one motion. Too fast. Guiltily. He was standing in the doorway. She had not heard him. Nobody ever heard him. For 3 full seconds, neither of them moved, and Elena understood that she was closer to death right then than she had been the night she woke up in his bed. His voice when it came was so quiet it was almost nothing. He told her never to touch that drawer again. She said yes, sir. She could not get her hands to stop shaking. He stood there. She waited for him to leave. He said her name was Isabel. That was all. He did not explain. He did not sit down. He did not offer her the story. He said a name into a room and then he walked out, and Elena stayed on her knees on the carpet with a dust cloth in her fist and finally understood why a bed in that house had gone 5 years without being slept in. She never opened that drawer again, but she started making the bed differently. She started leaving the left side untucked. She had no idea he noticed. He noticed on the first day, and he sat down in the hallway outside his own room for 10 minutes and could not go in. The phone call came on a Friday at 11 minutes past 3 while she was vacuuming. Her phone was not supposed to be above the ground floor. She had been breaking that rule for a month because there was a 12-year-old in a hospital across the river, and no rule on earth was going to make Elena Marsh unreachable. It buzzed once, she ignored it. It buzzed again. Then it started buzzing continuously and she turned off the vacuum, and the silence came down and she saw the name of the hospital on the screen. Dr. Nair did not do preamble. She said Sophie had spiked overnight, that her counts were bad, that they had her stable, and then she said the thing that took the floor out from under Elena entirely. Sophie had been removed from the transplant priority list, not for medical reasons. Elena asked twice because her brain refused to process it the first time. Dr. Nair told her the coverage had terminated at the end of the calendar year, that the family's financial responsibility could not be verified, and that the board had reviewed the case and reclassified it. The word she used was reclassified. There was a deposit required to restore candidacy and admit her to the transplant unit, $120,000, by 8 the following morning. Otherwise, Sophie would be transferred to palliative care, which is a phrase that means a room where a child is made comfortable while she dies. Elena stood in the middle of a bedroom that cost more than her mother's entire life and heard herself say she would get it. She had no idea where the words came from. Dr. Nair was quiet for a moment, and then in a lower voice off the record, she said something Elena would carry to her grave. She said this was not a medical decision. She said it had come down from the board, and that in 14 years she had never seen a pediatric transplant candidate reclassified in a single afternoon. Elena hung up. She did not cry. She sat down on the edge of the bed where she had once slept by accident, and she opened her cracked phone, and she searched the hospital board of directors, because she had spent 5 years learning that when something makes no sense in medicine, it is because the reason is not medical. The page loaded slowly. She scrolled past the physicians, past the donors, chairman of the Board of Trustees, St. Anselm Medical Center, Enzo Varga. She read the name 4 times. She looked at the photograph, a heavy man in his 60s, in a good suit, shaking hands at a ribbon cutting, and something in the back of her mind went very cold and very still, because she had heard that name in this house. She had heard it through a door. She had heard Mrs. Thorne say it on the phone in a tone she used for no one else. The man who was killing her sister and the man who owned this house were in the same war. And Elena Marsh, who had spent her whole life being invisible, understood in that moment that she had accidentally been standing on the only piece of ground in the state where she had any leverage at all. She waited for him in the dark. She did not turn on a lamp. She sat in the corner chair, the second one, the one that had appeared for no reason, and she put her hands in her lap and waited from 10 at night until 17 minutes past midnight. And she rehearsed what she would say, maybe 200 times, and every version of it sounded insane. The door opened. She heard him come in. She heard him reach for the light. She said, "Do not shoot." His hand stopped an inch from the switch, and his other hand was already inside his jacket, and for 2 seconds the entire house balanced on the point of a knife. He turned on the light. He looked at her, sitting in his chair in her gray uniform, with her knuckles white in her lap, and he did not look surprised, which frightened her more than anything else could have. He poured himself a drink with his back to her and told her she had 2 minutes to explain before he called his men. She told him she needed money. He set the glass down very carefully and turned around and asked her in a voice with absolutely nothing in it whether she had just broken into a mafia boss's private quarters to apply for a loan. She said it was not a loan. She said she needed $120,000. He asked if it was gambling, drugs, a boyfriend who owed the wrong people. She said it was her sister. She said Sophie was 12, that she had leukemia, that she had been pulled off the transplant list that afternoon, and that if the deposit was not paid by 8 in the morning, they were moving her to a room where children go to die. He watched her face while she said it. He was very good at that. He had spent 20 years reading people who were lying to him for their lives, and he searched her for the flicker, the swallow, the rehearsed cadence, and he found none of it, only raw animal terror held together by will. He turned away from her and walked to his desk and told the wall that he was not a bank and not a charity, that he was the man who owned the underground economy of that city, and that people who owed him money generally ended up in the harbor. He asked why in God's name she had come to him. She said because he had not woken her up. He went completely still. She said he could have thrown her out. He could have fired her or worse. Instead, he had handed her a glass of water, and that was the only kind thing anyone had done for her in 5 years. And she had nobody else on earth to ask. He stood with his back to her for a long time. When he turned around, he had already decided, and what he said next was not the decision. It was the cage he built around it. He told her that if he paid, she no longer worked for Mrs. Thorne. She worked for him. She would move into the estate permanently. She would not leave the property without his permission. She would not contact anyone outside it. She would be available at any hour for anything he needed inside that house. She started to say she would not do what she thought he meant, and he cut her off with a flash of genuine anger, the first real emotion she had ever seen on him, and told her he had no interest in buying a woman. What he wanted was her time and her absolute loyalty. She asked how long. He said until the debt cleared. At her salary minus living expenses, 5 years. 5 years of her life for one deposit. She was 24. She would be 29. She saw Sophie's face. She said, "Write the check." He wrote it in hard, aggressive strokes and held it out, and when her fingers closed on the paper, he did not let go. He made her look up at him. He told her she belonged to him now and that she was never to lie to him and never to betray him, because the next time she woke up in his bed, he would not be handing her a glass of water. He let go. She backed it out of the room with the check against her chest and made it to the end of the hall before her legs gave out. What Elena never learned, and what he never told her, was that he had already signed it. He had signed that check 9 days earlier, the morning after the fever, the morning he lay awake listening to a stranger breathe, and it had been sitting in his desk drawer since, waiting for her to ask. The 5 years were not a leash. They were the only way he knew how to keep somebody where he could protect them. 19 miles away in an office with the blinds down, Enzo Vargas sat watching a monitor with a cigarette burning to ash between his fingers. The image on the screen was slightly grainy, taken from an angle above a doorway, and it showed the second-floor corridor of the east wing of the Moretti estate. It showed a woman in a gray uniform stepping out of Adrian Moretti's bedroom at 26 minutes past midnight, holding something white against her chest. Varga leaned forward, tapped ash into a tray without looking at it, and told the man standing behind him that they had been trying to find the thing Adrian Moretti cared about for 5 years. He said they had just found her. Adrian's hand stayed on the bolt for a long time. Elena did not let go of his wrist. She could feel his pulse under her fingers, slow and heavy, and she could feel the exact moment he understood, because everything in his arm went loose at once, the way a rope goes when it is cut. On the other side of the steel, Dominic said his name again. He said, "Boss, come on. My guys are securing the west stairs. We have to move you." Adrian said nothing. Dominic said, "Please." And that was the word that finished it, because in 18 years, Dominic Hale had never once said please to him. Not when he was 14 and starving, not when he was 25 with a bullet in his hip. That word had been coached. Somebody outside that door had told him to sound frightened. Adrian put his mouth close to the seam and asked him one question. He asked what his mother's name was. There was a silence on the other side that went on for 4 full seconds, and in those 4 seconds, Elena watched a man decide to bury his own son. Dominic said Marta. Adrian said she died in '99, and you have never once said her name in this house, so somebody just handed it to you off a piece of paper, and I want you to know that I know. Then the pretending stopped. Dominic's voice changed. It got younger and uglier at the same time, and he started talking fast, and the whole story came apart against that door in under a minute. Varga had come to him 14 months ago, not with money, with a file. His mother had not died the way Adrian had been told. She had died in a state facility in Worcester under a name that was not hers. And Varga had the records, and Varga had the man who put her there on a payroll, and Varga had offered to give Dominic all of it in exchange for one thing. One night, one power grid, One door left unlocked. He said he never wanted this. He said they promised nobody would get hurt. Adrian asked him how the two men on the north gate died. Dominic did not answer. Adrian asked again, and his voice was so quiet that Elena had to lean in to hear it. And he asked whether Marco had seen it coming, because Marco had a daughter who was 4. Dominic started crying. Then he said the thing that changed the shape of the night. He said he did not come to open the door. He said Varga's second team was coming up the east stairs in about 90 seconds with a thermal lance, that they had lied to him about that too, and that they were not going to take Adrian alive. He said the woman was the target. He said Varga had been watching the house for 6 weeks and that everything, all of it, the hospital board, the transplant list, the deposit had been built to walk her into that house and find out whether Adrian Moretti still had anything left that could be taken from him. Elena stopped breathing. She had thought she found the connection between Varga and the hospital. She had not found it. She had been walked to it. A child in an oncology ward had been pulled off a transplant list by a 60-year-old man who needed to know if a widower had started sleeping again. Adrian looked at her in the dark, and she looked back, and neither of them said a word, and something in her went cold and hard and stayed that way for the rest of her life. Dominic said he was sorry. Adrian said go stand at the top of the east stairs. There was a pause. Then Dominic said, okay. Raphael came through the front of that house 4 minutes later with 40 men and no patients at all. And by the time the sun came up, there was nothing left of Varga's assault but a great deal of work for people who were paid to make work disappear. They found Dominic Hale at the top of the east stairs with a rifle and 11 rounds left in the magazine, and 2 of Varga's men dead in front of him and 1 behind, and he was still alive, barely, and he was still holding the position. They carried him down. Adrian was standing in the hall when they did. Dominic tried to say something. Adrian put a hand flat on his chest, not hard, and told him to save it. Then he told Raphael to get him a real doctor, not Evans. And Raphael said boss, and Adrian said he knows what he did, and he will know it every morning for the next 40 years, and that is not mercy, so do not look at me like it is. Nobody in that house ever discussed it again. Dominic Hale left Boston in March and did not come back. Adrian never spoke his name aloud again, and once a year on a date nobody else knew the significance of, he went out for 4 hours by himself and came back and did not explain, and Elena never asked. They found Enzo Varga at 11 minutes past 6 in the morning, sitting in the back of an SUV at the end of the property road, with the engine running and the heat on, because he had come to watch. That was the part that broke Adrian's composure more than anything else that night. Varga had not sent men. He had come personally and parked at a distance and sat there in a warm car with a coffee in the cup holder, waiting to see what would come out of the house. They brought him inside and put him in a chair in the dining room, and every man in that building expected the same ending, and it did not come. Because Elena walked in and set a folder down on the table in front of him. She had not slept. There was still plaster in her hair. She was still wearing the clothes she had crawled through a hallway in. She put the folder down in front of a man who had spent 40 years being the most dangerous person in every room he entered, and she opened it, and she started laying pages out one at a time like a woman dealing cards. The first page was Sophie's transfer authorization. Reclassification of transplant candidacy, signed by the chairman of the board. Varga looked at it and shrugged and said, children get sick. The second page was a copy of the board minutes for that afternoon, obtained by a night nurse named Rosalind Cruz, who had worked that floor for 19 years and who had liked a 12-year-old with no hair enough to make a photocopy she was not supposed to make. Varga stopped shrugging. Then Elena put down the third thing, and Adrian actually stood up out of his chair. It was a ledger, not his, a copy of 141 pages, handwritten and photographed, showing 16 months of payments routed through a medical charity. Varga chaired into 3 accounts, one of which had paid the salary of a man named Hale. Adrian asked her where she got it. She said from the drawer in his desk. She said she had been copying his books for 11 weeks page by page on a cracked phone with the flash off, and that she had photographed everything, including the pages that had nothing to do with her. The room went absolutely silent. There were 9 men standing along that wall, and every one of them understood that the woman had just confessed to the single unforgivable thing. Adrian asked her why. She said because the night he handed her that check, he told her she belonged to him now. She said she went upstairs and sat on her bed and thought about what that actually meant, which was that if anything ever happened to him, She would have nothing, and Sophie would have nothing, and a man like Varga would walk into that house and take it in a weekend. She said she did not copy those books to sell him. She copied them so that if he ever went down, she would have something to trade for her sister's life. Then she said the part that finished it. She said she had been carrying that copy for 11 weeks, and Varga had a man inside the house the entire time. And if she had ever intended to use it, she had 1,000 chances, and she never opened her mouth once. Adrian sat down slowly. He looked at the pages on that table for a long time. Then he asked Varga, without raising his voice at all, whether he understood what had just happened. He said this woman was handed the one thing that could destroy me, and she kept it because she was afraid of losing me. He said you had 18 years with a boy I raised, and you could not buy that. He said she had 6 weeks in a mop. Varga said something about how sentiment was how families died. Adrian said no, and that hospital boards were how families died, and then he told Raphael to make copies of everything. One set to the federal prosecutor's office through the usual channel. One set to the 3 families in the north who had lost money on those missing shipments because Varga had been stealing from them too, and it was all right there on page 29. Varga started to laugh, and then he understood, and he stopped laughing. He begged for a bullet. Adrian told him he had spent 40 years being untouchable and that he was going to spend whatever was left of his life in a room being handled by strangers, and that everyone he had ever frightened was going to read his name in a newspaper. Then he stood up and left the room and did not look back, and that was the last time the 2 men were ever in a building together. Sophie Marsh was restored to the transplant list at 2:15 that afternoon. Dr. Nair called the house herself. She said the paperwork had been reversed by the interim board, and then she said something else, and Elena had to sit down on the stairs. They had a match. A 23-year-old donor out of Ohio, 90%, registered 11 months earlier and never called until now. Elena did not cry when a man tried to kill her, and she did not cry when she shot one, and she did not cry when they took Dominic down the stairs. She sat on the 4th step of a mansion in Brookline with a phone against her ear and came apart completely, and Adrian stood in the hallway and did not touch her because he did not know if he was allowed to. The transplant was scheduled for the 29th, and on the 27th, he tried to send her away. She came in that morning and found the desk laid out. A trust document with Sophie's name on it, $3 million structured so that no one could touch it, not Elena, not him, nobody. A new passport. A key to an apartment in a building he owned outside the city, paid for outright. And the contract, not torn, not burned, sitting there squared to the edge of the desk, signed by both of them. He told her Raphael was waiting downstairs to drive her. She stood there and did not touch any of it, and she asked him whether he was firing her. He said he was releasing her. She asked why. He gave her the practical answer first because he was a coward about exactly one thing. He said the house was not safe, that Varga had partners, that people would come looking. He said she had blood on her hands and gunpowder in her hair, and she was 24 years old. She said, try again. He turned away from her, and when he spoke, his voice was not the voice that ran the Charlestown docks. He said she reminded him of a woman who used to sleep on the left side of that bed. He said Isabel had known what he was. She had known before the wedding. She had told him she could handle it, and she had said it exactly the way Elena said things, with her chin up, like the world was something you could simply decide to survive. He said he had believed her because he had wanted to, because he was 31 and selfish and in love, and 11 months later, she was dead on his mattress in a room that still had steel in the walls. And he had spent 5 years understanding one single thing, which was that she had not been wrong about herself. She had been wrong about him. He said he does not get to keep things. He said everything he touches goes into the ground. Elena listened to all of it. Then she walked across the room and stopped a hand's width from him and told him he did not get to do that. She said, do not ever decide for me what I can survive. She said he had built a whole story where he was the disease and she was the innocent, and that it was a very comfortable story for him because it meant he never had to risk anything. She said she was not innocent. She said she had been ruined long before she ever walked through his gate. She said she was 19 when her mother died. She said she had been a parent for 5 years without ever being a child, that she had counted coins on a kitchen table to decide between heat and antibiotics, that she had sat in a hospital hallway at 4 in the morning and done math about how long a body could last against a payment plan. She said that was hell. That was actual hell, and it was quiet, and it lasted years and nobody came. She pointed at the door with 9 bullet holes in it and said that this was just noise. He said Isabel died in this room. She said yes, and that his answer had been to stop sleeping, to fire every woman who lasted more than a month, to turn a house into a vault, and to sit in a chair for 5 years, punishing himself for the crime of having wanted something. She said she had made that bed every single morning for 6 weeks before she knew why nobody slept in it, and she had left the left side untucked for the last 4 of them, and he had never said a word about it, and she wanted him to say something about it now. He had nothing. For the first time in his life, he had absolutely nothing. So she said the only thing she had left. She said, I slept in your bed. She said you had a gun in your hand and every reason in the world, and you put it down and you gave me a glass of water. She said nobody had done anything for her in 5 years, and that man did, and he did not want credit for it, and he did not want anything back. She put her hand flat on his chest and said that she was not leaving unless he said out loud that he did not want her there. She said if he said it, she would take the passport and go and never contact him again. He did not say it. He stood there with her hand on his shirt and his heart going like something trapped, and then he brought his right hand up and closed it around the back of her neck and pulled her in. And when he kissed her, it was not gentle and it was not practiced. It was the desperate, clumsy motion of a man who had forgotten how, and she took hold of his shirt with both fists and did not let go. The trust document stayed on the desk. So did the passport. She burned the contract herself that night, and he watched her do it and did not stop her, and neither of them ever mentioned it again. Sophie Marsh went into surgery on the 29th at 7 in the morning. Elena was in the waiting room at 5:30, and Adrian Moretti, who had not sat in a public room in 9 years, who had killed men and buried men and stood in a warehouse and felt nothing, sat next to her on a molded plastic chair for 11 hours with his coat folded over his knees, holding her hand in front of strangers. At 6:40 that evening, a surgeon came out and told them it had gone perfectly. Elena turned and put her face into his shoulder, and he put his arms around her, and a woman across the room told her husband later that night that she had seen a man in a very expensive suit crying in a hospital waiting room and had no idea why. Sophie came home in April. Not to the apartment with the radiator that only worked if you hit it. That lease had ended in February, and Elena had not renewed it, and she had gone back exactly once to pack 4 boxes, and she had stood in that kitchen for a minute and a half and felt absolutely nothing, which surprised her more than grief would have. Sophie came home to a house with an electric fence and 12 men on rotation, and the first thing she said when she got out of the car was that it looked like a bank. Adrienne Moretti, who had not spoken to a child in 9 years, told her it was more secure than a bank, and Sophie said, prove it, and he did for 40 minutes, walking a 12-year-old with a surgical mask and 3 inches of new hair through the entire security system, while Raphael followed behind them, mouthing what is happening at Elena. The room they gave her had been the smallest bedroom on the south side, the one that got sun. Elena had chosen it for that reason. Sophie moved a chair to the window on the second day and started drawing and never really stopped. Within 3 weeks, there were pencil drawings taped to the walls of a corridor that had held nothing but a security keypad since 2019. Mrs. Thorne took them down once. She put them in a drawer in the service pantry neatly without comment because the house had standards and because a housekeeper of 31 years does not tolerate paper on a wall. Adrian found out at 9 that night. He walked down to the pantry, opened the drawer, took the drawings out and put them back on the wall himself, crooked with his own hands, and then he stood in the hall and waited for Camilla Thorne to come down. She came. He did not raise his voice. He asked her whether she remembered what the walls looked like before. She said, yes, sir. He said, then leave them. That should have been the end of it. It was not because the black notebook was still in her apron, and Elena had never stopped thinking about it. And one afternoon in May, she finally knocked on the door of Mrs. Thorne's sitting room and asked her outright why she had spent 4 months writing down the times a maid walked up a staircase. Mrs. Thorne looked at her for a long moment. Then she went to a shelf and took down the notebook and handed it over. Elena opened it and found dates going back 7 years. Not hers, everyone's. Every deviation, every unexplained absence. Every man who took a smoke break at a time he had never taken one before. 4 pages in November were devoted entirely to a member of the night detail who had begun arriving 11 minutes early to shifts he had worked the same way for 6 years. His name was on the top of the page. Hale. Elena's hands went cold. Mrs. Thorne said she had taken it to Raphael in December. She said Raphael had taken it to Mr. Moretti and that Mr. Moretti had told them both to drop it and that she had gone back to her room and continued writing anyway because she had worked in that house since Adrian was 25 years old, and she had promised his mother that somebody would keep their eyes open. Elena asked why she had never told her. Mrs. Thorne said because for 4 months she had not known what Elena was, and the whole point of the notebook was that you do not decide what someone is until you have enough pages. Then she said in exactly the same flat tone that Elena had earned her pages. That was the closest thing to affection that woman ever offered anybody, and Elena took it, and something in that house shifted permanently that afternoon. The capos came back in June. There were 11 of them, and it was the first full sit-down since the night of the storm, and every man at that table had spent 4 months hearing the same rumor, which was that Adrian Moretti had lost his mind over a housekeeper. Elena had not planned to be in the room. Adrian asked her to be. Not as a gesture, he asked because the northern ports were on the table and Varga's operation had been broken into pieces, and those pieces were being divided, and Adrian had been reading numbers for 6 weeks and could not make them come out right. And Elena had told him 3 days earlier over coffee without any particular emphasis that he was looking at the wrong quarter. She sat down in the chair on his right. That chair had been empty since 2010, and every man in that room knew whose it had been. A capo named Gio Battaglia, 68 years old, 40 years in, said out loud what all of them were thinking. He said with respect, "Boss, she cleaned your bathroom." The room went silent. Adrian did not answer. Elena did. She said that was correct, that she had cleaned that bathroom for 6 weeks, and that in the course of doing it, she had also organized 11 months of shipping manifests that had been sitting in a box under his desk because nobody in the house had the clearance to touch them. Then she told them that the discrepancy they had all been arguing about for 2 hours was not in the northern ports at all. It was in the Chelsea transfers. She said the loss had been booked as spoilage in the third quarter. That spoilage on that route had never exceeded 2% in 6 years, and that in the third quarter it was logged at 9, and that whoever had done it had been careful enough to spread it across 4 months and careless enough to use the same handwriting on all of them. She said she had seen that handwriting on a bill of lading in the West office. She named the man. He was sitting 4 seats down the table. He came up out of his chair, and 2 of Raphael's men had him against the wall before it was fully upright, and Gio Battaglia sat back in his seat and looked at that woman with an expression that had gone completely different. And after that, nobody at that table ever said the word housekeeper again. Adrian did not say a word during any of it. He sat with one hand around a glass he was not drinking and let her work, and when it was over and the room had emptied, he told her quietly that she had just made herself a target for the second time in 5 months. She said she knew. He said she could still take the apartment. She said if he offered her that apartment one more time, she was going to throw the trust documents in the fireplace. And he laughed, actually laughed, and Raphael heard it from the hallway and stopped walking. Sophie's counts came back clean in July. They came back clean again in October. In January, at the 1-year mark, Dr. Nair used the word remission and then explained carefully the way good doctors do all the reasons that word does not mean finished. Sophie listened to about 9 seconds of it and then asked whether she could get a dog. She got a dog. It was enormous and useless and terrified of the security dogs, and it slept on the end of her bed, and Adrian pretended for 2 years that he did not like it. The letter came in February. It arrived with the ordinary mail in an ordinary envelope, and Elena carried it up to the office with the rest of it because that was her job now, along with about 9 other things that had no name. It had a Palermo postmark. The handwriting was small and slanted, and the return name on the back was Moretti. Adrian went the color of paper. He did not open it for 2 days. It sat on that desk, and neither of them touched it, and the temperature of the entire house changed. And on the third night, Elena found him sitting in the dark with it in his hands, unopened, and she sat down in the second armchair and said nothing at all for 20 minutes. Then he opened it. It was from Isabel's mother. She had not spoken to him since the funeral. She had not answered a letter, a phone call, or a lawyer in 5 years, and everyone in that family had understood exactly why. Because on the day they buried her daughter, she had looked across the grave at Adrian Moretti and said one sentence in Italian that nobody translated for anyone. The letter was 1 page. She wrote that she was 79 and unwell. She wrote that she had spent 5 years unable to forgive him, and that she had recently understood that she had never actually been angry at him. She had been angry that her daughter had chosen him with her eyes open, and that there was nobody left alive to be angry at. She wrote that she had heard from a cousin that there was a girl in the house now, and a child. The last line said that Isabel had been happy for 11 months and that 11 months was not nothing, and that she was tired of pretending it was. Adrian read it 4 times. Then he folded it and put it in his pocket and went to bed and did not talk about it. And at 3 in the morning, Elena woke up alone. She found him standing in front of the dresser with the bottom drawer open. I had the picture frame in his hands face up, and he was just looking at it, and he had been standing there long enough that his hands had gone cold. He said he did not know how to do this. She took the frame from him, walked it across the room, and set it on the shelf beside the window, upright, facing into the room where anyone who came in would see it. He made a sound like he had been hit. She told him that she was not competing with a dead woman, and that she never had been, and that the only thing that had ever frightened her was living in a house where a person was not allowed to be mentioned. She said Isabel gets to be here. She said Sophie should know her name. She said this was her house first. He sat down on the edge of the bed and put his hands over his face, and Elena Marsh, 25 years old, stood in the middle of a room where two women's lives had intersected without ever meeting, and let a man grieve out loud for the first time in 5 years. It took about 40 minutes. Nobody in that house heard it except her. In the morning, the frame was still on the shelf, and it stayed there for the rest of both their lives, and the strange thing was that the room got easier after that, not harder. They married in September in a garden with 31 people. There was no priest anyone recognized and no photographer at all. Sophie, 14 and taller than her sister, by then walked Elena down a gravel path because there was nobody else to do it and because she had insisted loudly for 3 weeks. Mrs. Thorne cried and denied it for 11 years. Raphael gave a speech that was 4 sentences long, and one of them was about a microfiber cloth. And every man there who had been in that house in December understood it, and the ones who had not asked their wives what was so funny and got no answer. Elena did not take his name for the first 2 years. When she finally did, it was on a Thursday at a registry office with no ceremony at all, and she told him afterward that she had waited because she wanted it to be a decision and not a rescue. He said he had known that. She said she was aware and that it had annoyed her. The business changed slowly and then all at once. The Chelsea route went legitimate in the second year, then the freight lines, then the whole northern side of the operation, and there were men who did not like it, and two of them made that dislike into a problem, and neither of them made it into a second problem. It was not redemption. Elena would have laughed at anyone who used that word. Adrian Moretti did not become a good man. He became a careful one, which in that world was closer to a miracle. What he stopped doing was the part that mattered. There were no more nights when he came home and went straight to the desk instead of the bar. There were no more mornings where somebody scrubbed a floor before the day staff arrived. He was 43 when he stopped carrying a weapon in the house. He never fully stopped waking at 3 in the morning. Some things do not heal, they just get company. When it happened, he would find that a glass of milk had been left on the side table hours earlier by a woman who had learned his sleep the way other people learn a language, and he would drink it, standing up in the dark, and then he would go back to bed. Sophie went to college in Providence. She studied art, and then, to everyone's complete astonishment, including her own, switched to nursing in her third year. And when Elena asked her why she said that, when she was 12, there was a woman on the night shift named Rosalind who made a photocopy she was not supposed to make, and that she had thought about it every week since. Rosaline Cruz retired in 2031 with a pension nobody could explain and never asked about. There was a night years on when Elena could not sleep and went down to the kitchen and found herself standing in the exact place she had knelt with a needle in her hand, and she realized she had walked across that spot 4,000 times without thinking about it, and that this was what healing actually looked like, not forgetting. Just the slow, ordinary theft of a place back from the worst thing that ever happens in it. She was still standing there when he came down. He asked if she was all right. She said she had been thinking about the fact that she had almost not come to work that Tuesday, that she had sat on the edge of a bed with a fever of 103 and seriously considered calling out, and that the only reason she had gotten up was a copay due on Friday. She said their entire life had hung on a $40 copay. He said no. He said it had hung on the fact that when he pulled that blanket back, he had been too tired to be who he was supposed to be, and that he had thought about it every day for years, and he had finally worked out what actually happened in that room. He said he had not spared her. He said she had been the first thing in 5 years that made him want to lie down. They found the deed to the estate in his desk when he was 62, and he transferred it into her name that same month. And when Raphael asked him why, he said that a man should give a house to whoever made it one. Elena Moretti lived in that house for 31 more years. She kept the picture on the shelf. She kept the second armchair in the corner. She never once in all that time made the bed with both sides tucked in. The girl in the gray uniform who lay down for 60 seconds because her body finally refused to carry her one more step never knew that she had walked into the only room in Massachusetts where being unable to stand up anymore would save her life instead of ending it. She thought she was ruining everything. She was not. She was ending 5 years of silence in a house that had forgotten how to hold a living person, and she did it by falling asleep. Adrian Moretti drew a gun on his own bed at 2 in the morning and found a stranger in it, and he put the gun down and he lay down beside her, and every good thing that either of them ever had came from that single decision. He never once regretted it.